Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and you're all very welcome to the Irish Bioenergy Association Annual Conference Webinar Specials for 2021. We had hoped to meet you in person for our conference this year. However, due to COVID-19, unfortunately, we've had to revert to online for this year's conference. My name is Finan. I'm the CEO of the Irish Bioenergy Association. And over the next 4 weeks, we will discuss the COP26 goals and the critical role of bioenergy in achieving those goals. Today's webinar, we focus on goal number 1, securing global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. And we have a distinguished lineup of speakers for you this morning. We will have introductions from Paddy Phelan, who is the president of the Irish Bioenergy Association. We'll have a presentation from Dr. Paul Deane, Senior Researcher in UCC, followed by an overview of the biomethane market and industry across Europe from Harmen Dekker, Director of the European Biogas Association. And then we will have a chat with Christian Rakos, who is President of the World Bioenergy Association. I would encourage you to register for the next 3 webinars. Full details are available through our social media channels. So next week's webinar takes place this time next week, Wednesday the 13th of October. And it's goal 2 we will be discussing, which is adapting to protect communities and natural habitats and the role of bioenergy in achieving that goal. On the 20th of October, we will discuss the topic of mobilizing finance. Bioenergy is a key component of the bioeconomy, and this particular webinar falls on the same week as the Bioeconomy Ireland Week. So we will also discuss the bioeconomy at that webinar. And then we will conclude on Wednesday, the 27th of October, with discuss our final goal, working together to deliver. And that will be in the form of a panel discussion, interview style, with each panelist followed by a group panel discussion. We're delighted to also announce that Minister Pippa Hackett will join us for next week's webinar. So I would encourage you all to register for the upcoming webinars. And I do thank you for joining us this morning for today's session. So without further ado, just to briefly introduce our first speaker. So Paddy Phelan is the president of the Irish Bioenergy Association and also CEO of the 3-County Energy Agency. Paddy took over the role of president in 2019 and also is a member of the Council of the Energy Storage Association and a busy man with lots of other involvements in the energy sector. So I'd like to ask Paddy to turn on your camera and to share your screen and give us your introductory remarks and slides for the opening of this morning's session. So Paddy, over to you.
Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Paddy. And you can share,
I'll just ensure I'm in presentation mode.
And now you're in presentation mode. Yeah, thanks, Paddy.
Thank you very much, Sean. And welcome everybody to this morning's webinar, where we look today specifically at the critical role of bioenergy. It's, as Sean mentioned, it is part of a series of 4 webinars that will be running over the coming weeks. And I want to thank particularly Sean and the team in IrBEA for setting these up, and some very succinct and real challenge topics being covered over the coming 4 weeks. Today's particular one, as Sean mentioned, is looking at securing global net zero by mid-century and keeping 1.5 degrees within reach. And within this, we will discuss the critical role of bioenergy in achieving this goal and how the programme for government has set out an ambitious target of 51% emissions by 2030. So just a little bit from my perspective as president and understanding the challenge. So the 51% emissions reduction based on the national baseline sees us knocking over 30 million tonnes off our emissions chart based on 2019. And it's broadly understood, and this is reflecting on one of our speakers, Paul Deane's very useful slides that I've found very, very effective in terms of disseminating or giving an understanding as to where the emissions are coming from, and where they're coming from and where they end up. So as you can see, there's significant areas of opportunity there around decarbonising our sector. Again, just to give some of our speakers some context from an international perspective, at a regional or a local level, in Ireland, policy is heading in the direction of county climate action plans, which will be kicking off early next year. And each of the local authorities will be required to produce a climate action plan. And as part of that, in the current county development plan process, due consideration must be given to emissions and how the plan is going to impact that reduction in emissions. So at a local level, through my work with 3CEA, one can see, transport, residential, industry are areas that really need to contribute significantly to decarbonisation. One of the big questions that I think has to be asked and considered, is the cost of abatement. And, it's understood, and I think there's some more detail to come out on this from an economic perspective on what the cost to remove a ton of carbon from the Irish economy is. And I don't have these figures, but I've anecdotally understood that it's to be considered between €450 and €650 a tonne to remove it from our economy. And then each sector has differing costs of abatement. So domestic may be a lot more challenging and therefore more expensive. Agriculture might be simpler, and so on and so forth. So really, we're awaiting the climate action plan later this quarter. I understand it's due in November. And this will hopefully help us to define some methodologies around the sectorial splits, and also how we can adapt those at a regional and county level to support this transition. Just a little piece of work that, again, referring back to my work in 3CEA, where we've been working through an Interreg program called Energy, and we have been modelling the theoretically matched renewable energy supply with that demand in the three-county region or the southeast region of Ireland. And that's thrown up some interesting opportunities, where obviously naturally one of the central core pillars is e-communities and community energy. But again, biomethane and bioenergy, biomass are significant resources right across the sector into potential hydrogen to solve many of the challenges around renewable electricity, renewable heat and renewable transport. So in that, we're identifying the opportunity, but there are significant links missing in terms of the infrastructure or the supply chain to make this happen. Just looking at some of the global figures and referencing the Global Bioenergy Statistics 2020, at a global level, we still see 81% of total primary energy is provided by fossil fuels. And renewable energy technologies across all of the sectors account for 13.8%. Interestingly, hydropower is the largest renewable electricity generating sources with a share of 62% of that renewable piece, followed by wind at 19%. Bioenergy is providing over 637 terawatt hours internationally. So that's interesting. And the Irish figures are a long way behind that in terms of the global trend. And also from our interactions through IrBEA and our European colleagues in associations across Europe, there's a significantly more developed and much more vibrant and active space of bioenergy providing its part in terms of decarbonising. There's just some of the breakdown data from that study, which touches on where this bioenergy is coming from in terms of global domestic supply of biomass. So we all appreciate and understand that it's going to require a mix of technologies and solutions. Again, sustainable bioenergy is the large source of renewable energy globally, and the Climate Council will be required, in significant terms of ambition. And I've given a link in my slides, which I'm sure will be followed, to that World Bioenergy Statistical Report. Solid biomass will be required to decarbonise the heating sector across all temperatures, and I'll touch on the IrBEA supported and coordinated Renewable Energy Ireland heat plan 40 by 30. Again, biogas and biomethane will be needed for heating, transport and electricity. This industry can decarbonise primary and secondary agriculture also, which are all parts of this heavy lifting that we all have to participate in, taking our own loads towards 2030 and beyond to 2050. Again, liquid biofuels, ethanol, biodiesel and HVO, again, increasing blending rates to decarbonise transport is a real opportunity that Ireland needs to consider and adopt. Just a little piece in terms of Irish policy and the most recent publication last week or earlier this week of the revised National Development Plan. And I've just taken an extract and just some context that within it there's 12 mentions of renewable energy, but only one mention of renewable heat. There's one mention of biomass, bioenergy and biogas, and it's broadly extracted there, as you can see from my cursor, under strategic investment priorities in research, so not actual programs and delivery. If you read that green text, energy research funding to accelerate diversification away from fossil fuels to green energy, including wind, wave, solar, biomass, biofuels, biogas and hydrogen. And climate action fund to leverage investment by public and private bodies in climate action measures. So again, it's very clear when you read the text, and I've highlighted it to the right-hand side from the National Development Plan, that the target is again and concur with it in terms of increasing the percentage of renewable electricity to 80%. But within that, it primarily focuses on electricity generation and storage. You know, the requirements around increased networks. Conventional electricity generation and operational electricity systems provide security supply and variable generation. And it mentions wind and solar. Again, no mention of biogas, CHP, biomethane in terms of hydrogen, electrolysis, storage. It seems a very wind and solar orientated program, often mentioning throughout it the policies around offshore and onshore wind, assisting Ireland to decarbonise its energy system. Again, microgeneration to empower citizens to produce their own electricity. This is a scheme which was widely expected nationally last June, and we're not aware of any dates, and we hope that will be clarified within the revised climate action plan. Again, moving on in terms of today's experts, and I won't delay too long in introducing them, but I think you'll appreciate that across the group that IrBEA through Sean and Teresa have collated and brought together today, we're going to get a very broad and good perspective of what can be achieved, and really looking at some of the the notes around the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have recognized that bioenergy represents the largest current contributor to renewable energy across the world, and likely to remain that way for at least the first half of the next century. So really, bioenergy has got a very large role to play. In the heat sector, I just referenced the Renewable Energy Ireland, which is a grouping of all the renewable energy associations under the umbrella of Renewable Energy Ireland, chaired by Tanya Harrington and previously chaired by the current chair of the Climate Council, MaREI, who work very closely with us on a sectoral-wide renewable approach to achieving 40% renewable heat by 2030. And in this, it sets out very clearly the opportunity. It puts the different scenarios in play by 2030. And really for us within IrBEA, and for all of you across the Irish sector in terms of energy, we would implore the Minister and his department to encourage and continue to adopt a lot of the recommendations that have been found in this within the Climate Action Plan. And this has been issued to government last February, March, and therefore have had plenty of time to consider its contents. So really, we want to see ambitious targets around heat, as well as those that we agree with around renewable electricity. So again, to deliver the 7% reduction, we believe 40% renewable heat will carry a huge chunk of that load in terms of renewable heat, but also that bioenergy has a very large role to play across all of its technologies. Again, MaREI are working with IrBEA in terms of developing and delivering, and coming soon, an in-depth study around the role that bioenergy can play in transport and decarbonising that sector. And we look forward to implementing some of those across policymakers and decision makers over the coming weeks in advance of the announcement of the Climate Action Plan. So again, just in summary and conclusion, we all agree that the potential for bioenergy Ireland is significantly lagging behind that of Europe, and our speakers will probably be able to demonstrate that case in point. Again, bioenergy is part of the suite of emissions reduction measures, and we would urge that this become a stronger theme or a stronger topic within the broader policy documents being produced and schemes being developed. The scale of the challenge to decarbonise heat transport, electricity and agriculture is huge, and there does appear to be a blind spot in Irish policy around bioenergy. We've all identified that biomethane and biogas is going to have a large role to play in terms of decarbonising transport and heat. Again, crude oil contributes 92% of world energy transports, and liquid biofuels and biogas are the most sustainable and ideal options for the transport sector right now. Again, biofuels have a share of 3% and have experienced growth to 13% across the world, almost 6 times as much as the overall energy needs in transport sector. So we appreciate the potential is there. We understand the technologies are there, and we would ask that people consider the opportunity to support these in terms of decarbonising. And this is all in the context of increasing electricity prices, and that in the context of fuel poverty and the challenges that that's going to present to the citizens of Ireland over the coming years. Again, I want to thank you for joining, and I would implore and encourage you to get involved with IrBEA by becoming a member if you've not already done so. And more members creates the opportunity for us to continue to contribute, to engage, and to make the case and to do the piece of work that needs to be done to make sure that sustainable energy has a future, which includes bioenergy. I want to thank Teresa O'Brien for organising today's event, and Sean for all of his great work in collating all of these great studies, which we know and hope will influence policymakers into the future. So thank you all very much, and without further ado, I will hand you back to Sean to introduce the next speaker.
That's great, and thanks very much, Paddy, for your opening remarks and your slides there. You've very clearly set the scene for this morning's discussion. I'd just like to remind attendees this morning that you can post your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and we'll endeavour to get to as many of those as possible during our panel discussion at the end of the presentations. Our next speaker this morning is Dr. Paul Deane. Paul is a senior researcher with UCC MaREI. Paul will outline to us the current status of bioenergy and the potential for its deployment in Ireland. And also, as Paddy referred to, Paul is working closely with us in the development of a report on the transport sector, which we do hope to launch in the coming weeks. So I'd like to hand over to Paul for you to make your presentation. Thanks, Paul, for taking time off your busy schedule to join us this morning. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Sean, and thanks very much, everyone. As you were saying, Sean, it's an awful pity, isn't it, that we couldn't all meet up. I was really looking forward to, when I heard about this, I was really looking forward to meeting up with everyone. And sure, it would have been a great excuse just to get out of the house, if anything else. But hopefully, look, please God, the country's going in the right direction, and hopefully we'll all meet up sometime soon in the future. And thanks very much, Teresa, Sean and Paddy, for inviting me to speak to you this morning. Yeah, look, I work down in UCC in the MaREI Centre. We're the Science Foundation Ireland Centre for Renewable Energy here in Ireland. And we think about lots of things. Look, we think about the future of electricity, future of heating, the future of transport, of land use, how we produce our food, and how will we do all these things in the most efficient and integrated fashion that we meet our climate targets. And you know what's funny, actually, just while Paddy was speaking there, I was just reflecting, we often get criticized down here in UCC, actually, for, you know, I often get feedbacks, people saying, geez, what are they doing looking at bioenergy? Like, what do they believe? You know, and science isn't a belief system. It's an analysis. And I often say, well, why would you not look at bioenergy? You know, bioenergy is the largest form of renewable energy in Europe. It's one of the largest forms of renewable energy around the world, you know, and outside of wind in Ireland, which we've done incredible things. You know, we're really charging a trail in terms of renewable electricity here in Ireland. But remember, in heat and transport, which are 80% of our energy use here in Ireland, our most successful policies are bioenergy. So we have an incredibly successful renewable transport bioenergy obligation scheme here in Ireland. Every time you fill up your fuels, your car in the morning using petrol or diesel, you have bioenergy, liquid bioenergy there that's diluting the content of those fossil fuels. And that's a wonderful thing that bioenergy is able to do to get us closer to our emissions reductions targets, particularly in the terms of carbon budgets. And remember, that's really important. So bioliquids actually remove about 500,000 tons of carbon dioxide from the Irish energy system last year. That's equivalent to taking about 200,000 cars off the road. That's incredible. Why wouldn't you study that? You know, and then you look at things like renewable heat. Look at the most successful renewable heating policy that we have comes from solid biomass. And again, the fundamental role that it plays in decarbonising heavy industry. And they are the things that, you know, electricity just can't do. I always like to tell our students here when we're thinking about the future, remember that electricity is fundamentally important, but you can't put a plug on everything. You can't put a plug on everything. Some things are just technically impossible, and some things are just too expensive. And in the long term, that's one of the wonderful things that bioenergy will be able to help us out. Its flexibility, its resource potential, and also, as Paddy mentioned there, it touches on many of the very difficult sectors: heat, transport, agriculture, land use. And these are big issues for Ireland because they make up 80% of our energy use, but also 80% of our emissions. So why wouldn't you study bioenergy? You know, why wouldn't you look into it? Particularly such a rich country like Ireland in terms of the natural resources and the active ecosystem that we have here in Ireland. But first of all, look, we started off speaking about COP26, which will be on in Scotland next month. I'm not sure if any of you are going. We have some colleagues here in UCC who are going to head over. But one of the things that we must always remember, what's often forgotten when we're thinking about climate science, is that we tend to focus on one pathway to net zero, and there's actually way more pathways. You know, what we're looking at here is science from the IPCC. Now, the IPCC are the gatekeepers for the international scientific community when it comes to climate change. And they do lots of analysis, and they look at lots of different ways for the world to meet our temperature aspirations of 1.5 degree limit. What we're looking at here is a reduction in global CO2 temperatures between, well, it's actually 2010 here, but 2020 in the graph, out towards 2100. And look at the diversity of different reduction pathways. It's about 80 different ways we can actually meet our emissions reduction targets. And all these pathways, while they're quite different in terms of the speed of the transition or the different types of changes that will happen, they all share a number of really important commonalities. And the first thing that they share is energy efficiency. We must save energy if we really want to save the planet. That's fundamentally important. Electrification will play a really important role actually in the decarbonization of the global economy, along with renewables. And that not only means wind and solar, but it also means bioenergy. And this is the other thing that we see a commonality coming through these wide diversity of scenarios when we're thinking about the global future. It's that bioenergy is actually fundamentally important, not only in the long term for those hard to decarbonize areas such as transport, heat, and industry and agriculture, but also remember for diluting the fossil fuel content of fuels that we will remain in the energy system for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So bioenergy is wonderfully flexible, it's wonderfully adaptive, and early action on bioenergy gives significant savings when you look at it from a carbon budget perspective. So when we think about the global future, think about diversity in terms of options, but also resilient to those options is the role of renewables. And of course, central to that really is the role of bioenergy. Now, what I'm going to show you here again is this at a global level. And what we're looking at here is a little line graph. Now I'm going to animate this in a minute. And what it will tell us, it describes the total volume of fuels that we use in the world today, in the past, and into the future to meet our energy needs, but also in the future to meet our climate targets at a global level, so that 1.5 degree temperature limit. This actually comes from the IEA. I took this from the IEA because the IEA are often criticized for being a bit bullish about renewables, a bit bullish about energy efficiency, bullish about carbon capture and storage. But as we see here, this kind of reflects a lot of the general science in terms of the common trends of what we need to do, what we are doing, and where we need to go. And as I animate this graph here, remember this is a global scenario. So we're not looking at Ireland, we're looking at the global level. Although, look, to be honest, in many regards, Ireland shares a lot of the common features that we see here at a global level. And if we pause it here in 1990, look, as Paddy said, the world is dominated by fossil fuels, oil, coal, gas, with 90% of all our overall energy use. A little bit of nuclear, a little bit of biofuels, hydro, and then wind and solar are about 2% of overall global primary energy use at the moment. Let's look at that picture, how it has changed in the last 30 years and where it needs to go in the next 30 years. So I'm just going to animate it now. Keep an eye on the role of biofuels. It's just like a horse race. It's like keep an eye on the little green fella down here in the bottom, and let me animate this and see what happens as we move forward in time. So this is actually what's happening at the moment, massive increase in oil. And this is what we need to do. Now, isn't that stark? Like when you look at the rapid decarbonisation that's required. Now, remember, this is not a forecast. This is not a prediction. This is not what will happen. This is what we must make happen if we're serious about our climate targets. And the obvious things, look, oil, coal and gas need to fall off the cliff. No, they won't be eliminated completely from the energy system. That's just impossible. We won't be able to move away from fossil fuels that quickly. And in all these scenarios, there's some element of fossil fuel development. Some areas you just can't move away so quickly. But look at the massive growth in renewables. Look at the huge growth in solar. Look at the huge growth in wind. And that reflects the impact of electrification. Electrification is really important because things that use electricity tend to be just more efficient than the things that don't. So motors are way more efficient than engines. So cars, heating, air source heat pumps and all this. But also look at the massive role of biofuels. And this is liquid biofuels, solid biofuels, and gaseous biofuels. So in a primary energy context, bioenergy will make up about a quarter of our primary energy supply globally going into the future, a lot less in terms of final energy. And this is actually robust across many of these global scenarios, also from the International Renewable Energy Agency, the IPCC. So we need to do lots of things. We need energy efficiency. Yes, we need electrification. But remember, electrification can't do everything, and it needs help, not only in diluting, as I said, the content of fossil fuels, but also for decarbonizing other industries and other end-use sectors as well. So I say to people when they ask us about bioenergy and UCC, show them these type of graphs. Why wouldn't you be seriously looking at bioenergy? Let's not ignore the science. Let's follow it. Let's wrap the policy around this and see what we can do around this. So coming forward now, let me just move on to the look. Sure, I'll show you that one again. It seems it took me so long actually to get that. We might as well have another look at it. So again, the important role of biofuels into the future, and then coming back into Ireland today. And Paddy mentioned, there is a reputational challenge, isn't there, with bioenergy across in Ireland and maybe in some parts of Europe, although not so much in certain parts of Europe, as we'll hear from the other speakers later on. But, renewable electricity has captured the political and social mind, hasn't it? We all like the idea of shiny solar panels, wind turbines, Elon Musk electric vehicles. We love that kind of stuff. It's shiny, it's attractive. Bioenergy is very much in the limelight. It's very much a blind spot. And often when we talk to policymakers and say, actually our most important renewable transport policy is bioliquids. Our most important renewable heat transport and renewable heat policy is biomass. They often find that's surprising. And this is the energy mix that we have in Ireland today. So this is a Sankey diagram. If you're an engineer, you might be used to these type of things. But in simple terms, what you're looking at here is on the left-hand side, as you look at it, they're the fuels. The size of the bar represents the volume of fuels. And on the right-hand side, the far right-hand side, that's where we use those fuels in terms of final energy. And again, if you just stand back and look at this graph, you see there's a little bit of wind, a little bit of solar. But look, 90% of all our energy in Ireland is fossil fuel based. Today, 6th of October, we're going to spend about 12 million euros today over the next 24-hour period importing fossil fuels from abroad. Isn't that ridiculous when you think about just what a rich country we are, not only in terms of wind and weather, but in terms of our active ecosystem. When you look at the challenges farmers are having in terms of looking to try and diversify their options, when you look at our massive reliance on imported energy, when you look at energy security, when you look at the challenges of agriculture around manure management, when you look at all the opportunities, I think that's really a really silly amount of money to be leaving this country when we've got so much potential here on our doorstep in terms of bioenergy and in terms of our other renewable energy resources. And just to finish off, this is a piece of study that we did for SkillNet Ireland with Renewable Energy, or with the Wind Energy Association of Ireland, looking at 2050. And as Paddy said, look, we set this target in Ireland for a net zero energy system by 2050. If we're serious about meeting it, look, we have to be serious about bioenergy. Again, and it comes back to the fact that wind and solar are wonderful. They can't do everything. You know, you can't put a plug on everything. You can't electrify everything. At some point, it just becomes too expensive, too technically difficult. And remember as well, we do have to, because we're thinking about carbon budgets, cumulative emissions matter. So we need to dilute the current content of fossil fuels while we wait for electrification and all these other elements to catch up. So bioenergy meeting about a third of all our primary energy needs in the future. This is within a least cost system. So of course we need to get serious about bioenergy at a political, at a social, and at a financial level if we're really serious about our climate change obligations. And finally, just to finish off my key messages, looking at the science. I love the science, you know, and you can't ignore the science. We have to move away from ideology and we have to look at analysis. And we look at all the analysis in the IPCC, International Renewable Energy Agency, the IEA. Bioenergy will become increasingly vital to induce sectors. And this last section here, and I know I think Paddy, you mentioned this will probably come into more focus in the next workshop in the next couple of weeks. But again, you know, taking a piece here from IrENA, bioenergy, of course, like every other form of renewable energy, you know, it's not just for bioenergy. Batteries, EVs, and storage must all be produced in ways that are environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable. You know, and again, coming back to science, the potential is large. The political appetite now needs to be realized, needs to be encouraged. The case is there scientifically, and what we need to do now is make financial cases because the climate case is there very clearly for bioenergy, not just in Ireland, but right around the world. So, Sean, I might just hand it back to you there now, and I'll leave it at that. So, thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
That's great, Paul, and thanks very much for your presentation and giving us your insights. And we are in the association very excited about the prospects of bioenergy playing an increasing role into the future. However, we're disappointed that that hasn't been recognised by many at an Irish level, at a political level. But we're now going to hear from some of our European colleagues and world colleagues. So first up is Harmen Dekker. Harmen is with the European Biogas Association, of which IrBEA is a member. Harmen is the director of the EBA and is going to present to us this morning about the current status of the biomethane and biogas industry across Europe and share his thoughts in terms of how biomethane and biogas can help us to achieve this goal of securing global net zero by mid-century and keeping us within the 1.5 degree, keeping that within reach. So I'm looking forward to your presentation, Harmen, and thanks very much for taking time off your busy schedule to join us this morning.
Well, thank you, Sean, and also thanks for having me and having the EBA at this webinar and a series of webinars. And I'm sure this will be very interesting. If all the speakers are as interesting as the previous ones, as Paddy and Paul has been showing. What I would like to do today is show you a little bit on the perspective on biomethane, which is of course one of the bioenergies of the future. And particularly focusing on biomethane. So first of all, let me try to go to the next slide. Yep, there we are. We've been speaking about, of course, the role of biomethane in the total. And Paddy showed a slide where the CO2 emissions of various sectors, and I believe those are provinces, and if I remember well, Kilkenny was one of them with 53% emission on agriculture on CO2 emissions. Well, this is very much in line what the European Union has already said, that where the biggest emissions are in agriculture, waste and oil and gas. And the reason of that is lots of those areas are producing methane emissions. Now, these methane emissions can be curbed. Methane is a very potent CO2 gas or CO2 contributor. And if we can curb that, of course, we can make great savings on CO2. And actually not well known to many of us, but biogas is actually an enabler to capture that methane emissions and actually make use of that in a good sense and make energy or even heat from that. So what does this mean? Europe is recognizing by now the role of biomethane, although especially in the production side. So where you see that they are supporting in the farm to fork strategy, but also in the methane strategy, the role of biogas to ensure that we can capture the methane emissions, but also can produce renewable energies. But moreover, it is also seen as a role to enhance the rural areas. So where biogas is uniquely positioned, as we are the only one which are actually in the midst of society. We are with the biogas providing the local jobs, providing the energy locally, but also can supply the energy further. And at the same time, actually providing also nutrients to our depleted soils within Europe, which is so important. And on top of that, and also maybe very important to know, is we can provide biogenic CO2. Why do I mention that? Is recently, and I'm sure especially in Ireland, but recently we've seen a shortage on gas, or at least the natural gas prices are spiking. As a result of that, the fertilizer companies, which are producing our chemical fertilizers, have ceased production. And the knock-on effect of that is, because of the high gas prices, knock-on effect of that is that the CO2, which is being captured by those chemical fertilizer companies, and normally goes to companies like Coca-Cola, is not being supported anymore. So there is a shortage on CO2 as well. Now the solution is perfect here. We can provide locally the energy, we can provide locally the nutrients, we can provide locally the jobs. And as Paul has already said, why shop abroad for energy if we can make it ourselves in our countries? So I'll elaborate a little bit on that, but it shows the picture on what biogas and which the Fit for 55 Europe has been put in place, which role biogas is playing in many of those items which are there. So looking at this is we are playing a role in transport. So the transport directive, which is now not on energy based anymore, but will be on CO2. There we have a great role to play, and we are especially making sure that in the heavy duty transport, there is a long-term role for biogas, biomethane, or more particular bioenergy. But also within the RED 3, the RED 2 has not even been implemented yet by many countries within Europe. And we're talking already about the RED 3 because we need to make sure that there is more renewables in our system. So that's why they are introducing already, and they're talking about the RED 3 already. And there is an upsurge for renewables to 40%. And advanced biofuels 2.2% without double counting. And I might go a little fast, of course, open for questions. What is excellent is that we are now focusing as well on the maritime sector and making sure that the maritime sector can go to renewables as well. And you must know as well that bioenergy in specific is one of the main fuels of the future for the maritime sector to decarbonize. It allows for quickly rebuild without actually providing zero emissions, also in the shipping sector. The ETS system is going to be extended and it will be extended to the shipping as well as to the buildings, which will have separate ETS systems. And especially for the buildings, I would like to make an extra remark. Paul rightly said that we need to focus on energy efficiency and to make sure that we are using actually less energy where we can. Now, the opposite is actually at this moment happening within Europe. Last week I heard a story that within 10 years, probably the cars which we are driving, the electric cars, most of the electric energy which will be in there will not be used for the coming from A to B, but will be used for all the gadgets which are in the car. So it means that we are not still focused on reducing our electricity consumption. And we see that also, of course, with the cryptocurrencies, which is taking a lot of energy as well. We are seeing this with the data we're storing. We are seeing this with all. And what does this mean on the heating side and on the buildings is that if we go to that route, we must make sure that we are insulating our homes first before we go to a renewable energy. Biomethane in that space is the cheapest way in combination with insulation to make sure that the homes are being sound for the future. Now, I want to show you the next picture. This is our future. Biogas at this moment within Europe is producing 193 terawatt hours of energy. That is, just to give you a little, so it makes it easier to understand, this is actually the exact amount of natural gas consumption of the country of Belgium at this moment. Now, most of this is being produced still as electricity, but there is a transformation going on within our biogas plants, 19,500 biogas plants within Europe. There is a transformation going on to go to biomethane. The picture here shows independent reports in the past 2.5 years, which have come out from Gas for Climate, Eurogas, International Energy Agency, CERI, CE Delft, all predicting a large portion of sustainable biomethane in future. That is biomethane only, not electricity production. That is an add-on to that. Meaning that we can provide, if we go to around about 124 billion cubic meters, around about 30 to 40% of the total gas need in future. So how is that being done? I'll just go quickly through the next slides. We produce now in total 18.2, this is 2019, 18.2 billion cubic meters on energy, and 2.4 billion cubic meters on biomethane. Now here you see the number of biomethane plants already rising within Europe, and actually it's a double-digit growth every year, knowing that it's becoming increasingly difficult to grow double-digit when we are growing. This is an amazing story. And actually I can announce that by today in 2021, and we are not even finished, we have already reached 1,000 biomethane plants within Europe. And they tend to be also a little bit larger than the biogas to electricity production. Here you see some of the countries which are really embracing this. And we see here that France is taking a large portion of the new biomethane development. There is a new country, but Italy is coming up in the coming years as well. But we see developments in all countries like Poland, Scandinavia, Netherlands, Belgium, are coming up as well, and Spain has put in some new measures to promote biogas as well. Just one remark, I said sustainable biomethane, I did that on purpose. Of course, there is a lot of pressure from NGOs saying that energy crops and land use, that is not very sustainable. Now, it could be debatable on how sustainable it is. But if you look on what is happening already is that the energy crops are being almost all left out in the energy and in the feedstock mix for producing energy. And this is good. And when the previous picture showing 125 billion cubic meters, which is possible, that is all produced in a full sustainable way, producing zero emission CO2 or even below zero emission, which only, of course, bioenergy can do. So the key policy focus for our sector in 2021, but also onwards is, of course, the European Green Deal and the lights for the COP26, actually, where we will be presenting as well. So I hope to see you there, Paul. But of course, all those policies which are related to biogas. That is maybe also the detriment of our industry. We have too many policies influencing our industry. But it means that if there are so many which are influencing our industry, it means also that we have a positive impact on many of them. And that is our unique position. With that, I would like to conclude. If you would like to know a little bit more on what is happening in Europe, we have our conference on the 26th to the 27th of October, where actually high-level speakers, even of the European Commission, are coming as well, and you're cordially invited. But for now, many thanks for listening. And any questions, then do let me know.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Harmen, for your presentation. And I think it's amazing to see the growth in biomethane and indeed biogas development right across Europe. And very disappointing that we haven't seen the same levels of deployment here. And maybe we'll discuss that as part of our panel discussion later on. I do see that the questions are coming in. There are a number of questions in the Q&A tab. So if any of our attendees this morning have any questions for any of our panelists or indeed general comments and feedback, feel free to place them within the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to them shortly. I'd just like to remind you again, for those that have joined us in mid-session, we will hold webinar number 2 of our IrBEA National Bioenergy Conference next Wednesday at the same time. And next Wednesday, we will discuss goal number 2, which is adapting to protect communities and natural habitats and the role of bioenergy in that. And we are delighted that we will be joined by Minister Pippa Hackett, Michael Kottner from the IBBK, German-based organization, Biogas organization, our own IrBEA Vice President Maurice Ryan from Greenbelt, and also Chris Johnson from FB Northern Ireland to speak about the role of energy crops in terms of promoting communities, but also promoting biodiversity. So that's next week's schedule, and I would encourage you to register for that session and indeed the following 2 as well. So next up is Christian Rakos. So I'd like, Christian, if you could turn on your video and unmute yourself. And thanks very much for joining us this morning, Christian. I know you've been busy traveling over the last few days and have made a special effort to attend this morning. So thanks very much. So Christian works for ProPellets, which is the Australian Wood Pellet Industry Association, and also is president of the World Bioenergy Association from 2019 to 2021, and has recently been elected. So I wish you best of luck in your role for the next 2 years, Christian. So maybe if you could start, maybe tell us a small bit about your organization and what you actually do, and maybe give an idea of who your members are. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to join this webinar. I have lived in Ireland for a year, but it's pretty far back in the past, and I enjoyed that as one of the best years of my life. So I'm a real fan of Ireland, and I'm glad to be here, at least virtually. Talking about the World Bioenergy Association, we are an umbrella organization. We have about 250 members, both associations and industries, and our role is to ensure that bioenergy is visible in the large global organizations like the United Nations, International Renewable Energy Agency, etc., etc. So I think the issue we have in Ireland that bioenergy is not properly visible to the policymakers. This is not an Irish specific Irish issue. It's an issue all over, and we try to address this issue at the global level. So that is what we try to do. We also see networking as one of our main activities. In our webinars, we have people from up to 70 different countries, which is super interesting, and I think it's very relevant because bioenergy technology is developing very rapidly. There are lots of news, and people want to learn about these news, and that is what we try to make available. Our webinars are currently our most successful activities, actually.
Okay, and just could you give us an insight, Christian, like some of both Harmen and Paddy and Paul have articulated a lot of the potential for bioenergy. Can you just give us an outline of the current status of bioenergy deployment at a world level?
Absolutely. I'll share my screen shortly. this is the current distribution of primary energy supply between fossil energies and renewables. You can see that renewables are still quite small, 14% only, which needs to be changing dramatically in the coming years. Now, if you look at the renewables pie, bioenergy at a global level is almost 70%. So bioenergy plays a critical role in the current use of renewable energy, and as was pointed out by Paddy, will play a critical role in the future also. Now, looking at the IEA net zero scenario, sorry, that was too fast. That scenario shows more specifically how this expansion of biogases, of biomass is going to take place. And what you can see is that all areas of biomass will be growing very substantially, including biogas, biofuels, solid biomass used in the field of heat generation, both for residential and for industry, and in electricity. So all of these sectors will grow very substantially. The only sector of bioenergy that is considered to decrease is the traditional use of bioenergy. You know that 3 billion people are still using firewood as their main source of energy. Much of this use is unsustainable for various reasons, and that should be replaced by modern forms of bioenergy. But a part of that, all other sectors are going to increase.
Okay, thanks. That's very good insight, Christian, into the deployment at a world level. What would you attribute this to? Why is bioenergy, in terms of in comparison to all the other renewables, taking up that large percentage of that chart?
Well, first of all, obviously, humanity has always lived on bioenergy. That was our most important source of energy since humans existed. And then the other reason is obviously because it is abundant. Please consider that plants are absorbing enormous amounts of carbon dioxide permanently, and they are partly releasing that by their breathing in the night. Plants are releasing part of that CO2, but a large part is released by decaying of plants. And this amount is 7 times larger than the total CO2 generated by fossil energy. So if we can make sure that we use plants instead of letting them decay, what that does is create very large amounts of energy.
Okay, so that presents an opportunity potentially for the biogases and the development of and the harvesting and harnessing of those biogases and the use of that gas into decarbonize our various systems.
It also applies to wood, for example. I mean, if you leave the wood in the forest to decay and you don't use it for bioenergy, it's simply lost. It's just a lost opportunity. Okay,
and just as a follow-on from that, certain countries have embraced bioenergy, others haven't as much. What do you see as the main barriers to the future growth of bioenergy at a world level?
One is awareness, I think. So I think the role of associations is really important to raise the awareness. And one of the barriers is really that our sector is so kind of fragmented that our interest organizations are weak. And I would really ask all of you that are looking at this webinar, please realize that you need speakers that kind of broadcast your message. And these speakers are the national associations, the international associations, and these associations need members, need support to realize that.
Okay. And just as a final question and comment, can you particularly outline the opportunities you see and the future developments in bioenergy? You mentioned there about maybe use the word more modern forms. So can you just maybe give an outline of where you see the opportunities in terms of bioenergy, maybe in terms of technology, in terms of research and development. So can you articulate those for us, please?
The opportunity, first of all, I think the biggest opportunity is that we will eventually finally end up in a market-driven expansion. I think that will be much healthier than this public policy supported expansion, which is very much dependent on the current trends in policymaking. We will see a market-driven expansion, and with the peaking of the energy prices right now, gas and electricity prices, we are getting a flavor of what that situation could look like. It will entirely change the picture. One of the opportunities that are not very well regarded is the heat market. I think the heat market is 50% of the entire European energy market. People keep talking about the electricity. Heat is the big chunk. It's not electricity. So we need to look at how to develop the heat market. And I think bioenergy has a huge role there to play, particularly because it offers stored forms of energy. And you need energy storage for the winter if you want to kind of have a balance of supply and demand. That's one of the things that I have been really focusing for most of my professional life. But of course, there will be also many other markets, be it the fuels market, the gas market, the power market. All of these markets present opportunities. One thing I would like to mention that you will probably, it doesn't really fit into the typical picture we talk about bioenergy. I do believe that global trade will also play a role. So it's not only about using your own resources. Of course, it is a huge opportunity, but the global trade flows offer an opportunity to balance local demand and local production. And that is an additional opportunity, I see.
Just a follow-on question from that. In terms of the market-driven expansion that you speak of, how do we mitigate against the risk that that poses potentially to the development of certain bioenergy projects? Or have you any thoughts on that area? If we want to, if that's going to be a problem from the point of view of if there's a very volatile market scenario around various fuels and energies, that could pose a problem for us as a sector in terms of getting that investment in to grow and develop bioenergy production facilities and other areas. Would you agree?
I don't believe that is going to be the case. I mean, we're heading to a situation where there is a permanent energy scarcity. If you really want to decline gas and oil use, and the IEA is now promoting to stop prospecting for oil and gas, which is really amazing. And all the big oil companies are kind of reconsidering their entire setup. It means that energy will be short and energy prices will be substantially higher than today. So I don't see that this kind of volatility is a risk for raising finance. I believe all the opposites. Financing energy, renewable energy projects will be very attractive.
Okay. If I could bring in Paddy, Paul and Harmen just to join the conversation. And we will go to our questions from our participants and attendees this morning in a couple of minutes. So if we could ask Paddy as well to join. So maybe if I could bring you, Paul, in terms of the major issues which are always posed in terms of bioenergy are around sustainability and availability of resource. And so could you maybe give your thoughts on that and from a scientific perspective, because there are two key aspects that are thrown at us a lot of the time in terms of discussions on future growth of bioenergy. So would you have any comments on those particular aspects?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And look, as Christian has mentioned and Paddy has alluded to earlier on, look, any industry needs policy. And, you know, the one thing that industry craves most is certainty, isn't it? You know, and it needs certainty, and it needs a direction of travel, and it needs strong regulation and strong certainty. And I suppose the challenge is, really, Sean, like from a political perspective, when you think about bioenergy, like we've had a couple of false starts, 10 years ago, the Miscanthus and Willow thing was just a disaster. That was, we've had a situation up north with cash for ash. So there's been reputational contagious damage, I suppose, to the industry, and this, we've seen this right around the world, I suppose a lot of that would be rooted as well in, the challenges and the problems, the very real problems with some, with the palm oil exploitation and the draining of peatlands in Malaysia. And even though, that's a very different type of bioenergy, but, to the general public, to the general media, to the general politician, bioenergy is bioenergy. It's a bit like saying all music is bad and not recognizing that there's different categories and different relevance and different flavors. So I think from a kind of a policy perspective, we're starting on the back foot in Ireland in terms of dealing with that reputational fallout, which is unfortunate. But again, I think what we need there is, as Christian said, we need to talk about it, and we need to be open and upfront about the regulations that we can put in place around sustainability. Look, it's no secret that Minister Ryan has raised his concerns around the sustainability issue about intensification, and they're very real and they're legitimate. But it also suggests that they don't have confidence in enforcing the current legislation that is there. And that's a pity as well, So I think it's cutting off your nose to spite your face. And again, look, it's ignoring the science. As we've mentioned with the previous two speakers, 80% of our energy challenge is in heat and transport. They're the areas that bioenergy gives most value. And it's up for us in the industry in Ireland and in Europe, to put the best foot forward to show that it can be done sustainable in a sustainable way. To encourage independent certification, to encourage transparency, to encourage openness. And I think, and we've already started that in Ireland, and let's hope now we can get an industry up and running, show that it can be done correctly and that it can be done economically.
Okay, and just if I could pick up on one point you made, a very interesting point, Paul, in your presentation. You mentioned about how bioenergy, we haven't captured the political and social mindset and limelight. Could you give us maybe some of your thoughts in terms of how potentially we could change that? And how do we get into the mindset of some of our policy and decision makers to actually force this change that will be for the betterment of the country and our energy supply system?
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because every industry needs a champion. Like EVs have got the Elon Musks and the Bill Gates, and Minister Ryan has been an incredible champion of renewable electricity here in Ireland, and you need those political champions. And in Ireland, we just don't have one at the moment. And not only does the industry need it, but the rural communities need it, farming communities need it, the heat industry needs it, and there's just no one stepping forward, because you need to connect an idea with a face and with a political voice, I think that's where renewable electricity has been so successful, Sean. Now, Minister Ryan was incredibly supportive, I think, of bioenergy, in his first term in government back in 2007, 2008. And then, of course, there was that fallout around the palm oil stuff, which was which caused massive contagion, I think, within the industry. So I think we need a political champion. We need someone who understands the cross-sectorial issues. That it's not just about energy, as Paddy said. It's about farms, it's about rural communities, it's about industry, and that's tricky to find sometimes, Sean.
Thanks, Paul. Paddy, if we could bring you into that particular point, would you agree that we need a political champion? And maybe what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think what Paul has mentioned, and in our own interactions with Minister Ryan, he has mentioned about his efforts in his previous ministry in the energy space around supporting biomass and it not coming to pass or not being delivered in that period. We've had schemes in the Irish context, and we have the most recent one, which is the SSRH, which is now almost 2 years and 3 months old, and we only have a handful of heating systems going through that. And in that sustainable support scheme for renewable heat, which is the national policy, we have no heat pumps and no renewable biomethane or gas plants through that process yet. And as you appreciate, Sean, the significant work that you through IrBEA and its members are doing to fill the gaps in terms of legislative or regulation and make sure that all of these questions that are being asked about the sustainability of bioenergy are being met in terms of emission certification, planning, regulations, fire, etc. But to turn it back maybe to a positive note, for some reason, and I can't understand why, a global lead in terms of corporate social responsibility in Danone milk production in Wexford is the first producer of zero carbon milk powder, and by their biomass plant, which they invested in through their own CSR, back in 2011, which is supplied from the local Wexford Wood Fuel Producers Group. And that's been a significant chunk of them achieving that zero carbon milk. There is an industrial champion using biomass in a very, very clean tech scenario. So powder milk is, equivalence to biopharma, it's equivalence to, clean room technology, and biomass can coexist. And at the scale which supports that local economy, local farmer producer model. And that was developed through the Rural Development Programme with leader support from Kilkenny. And there's an example, but when we bring that to the fore, nobody at the political level picks it up and uses it to their benefit or to the benefit of the national story. So, I mean, there are examples out there that have been extremely successful and do, meet and tick all the boxes. But for some reason, this blind spot that we keep referring to exists. And I'm not sure is a second mirror required to make them look right around that corner. But certainly in terms of the production of evidence from science with support of the likes of Paul and the MaREI report around transport, the support of Xavier Debussen in terms of the heat plan, and Renewable Energy Ireland in bringing all of the renewable associations together. It's acknowledged across all the associations, wind, solar, that electricity cannot do it on its own. Paul has echoed that, you can't put a plug on everything. So we've identified in those plans where bioenergy can play its role in heat and transport. And it's really now for us, as an industry, but also for the members of the likes of our association to come forward boldly based on the information we've heard this morning and be confident of the significant role it can play and how the market, if policy won't support it, it's looking from what Christian has suggested, that the market is going to support it. So having confidence to secure that green investment and drive this industry forward, because we can't wait forever for policy. Okay, thanks, Paddy. If I could bring in Harmen, just in terms of, you mentioned, and it is a great story in terms of the growth in the number of biomethane plants reaching 1,000, you said, currently at a European level. Can you just outline to us, because a lot of the areas where biogases and biomethanes are criticised at an Irish level is around the use of chemical fertilizer to grow crops, and very clearly your charts show that it's based on waste material. That waste material is obviously given a value as a result of its incorporation in biomethane, but the valuable products that are produced from biomethane plants are the digestate materials. So can you just give us your thoughts on the opportunities which exist in terms of digestate, in terms of nutrient management with the broader biomethane biogas industry?
Sure, thanks for the question, Sean. As said, of course, we had previously a lot of slack with regard to the energy crops and also with regard to the fertilizers and the pesticides which were used to ensure that it was grown. Nowadays, it is not necessary anymore. So our biogas production, which we can and which I showed, can be fully sustainable. And more than that is the digestate, which can be which is produced, can be either separated, so we can take out the phosphorus, we can take out the nitrogen, or we can use it as it is and put it back to the soil. And I would like to highlight two studies to this. One is an Italian study which highlighted the differences between chemical fertilizers and organic fertilizers, such as digestate. And of the 18 parts which were determined as being critical, organic fertilizers such as digestate outperformed on 12 of them. And on the other 6, with good management, we could even also improve further and be on par or better than chemical fertilizers. So it is all about how to manage and to see the difference between the chemical fertilizer and organic fertilizers. The second study, which is not out yet, but it's coming out very soon, is a study on sequential cropping. So you might be aware that a lot of the land beside, once it's used for food production, after that normally it's bare. Farmers are putting sometimes grass on it to cover it, to make sure that nitrogen emissions are not occurring. But as already said before by the speakers, one of the big items is that when you plow it under, you get the CO2 emissions again back from decay of the plants. Sequential cropping means that after the main crop, you put a crop on the field, which you take off with minimum tillage, so you do not disturb the soil. Two advantages there. One is when you select a crop with long rooting, you do carbon farming actually within the soil immediately. So we are are busy with the restoration of the soil. Secondly, of course, we can use that again for using the energy, using the digestate again to bring back to the field to give nutrients back to the soil as well. So it's a full closed loop circle. And this study actually showed that in all climate areas, including Ireland, we can put this system on. And that will, if all land would use that, that would actually amount to around about 180 billion cubic meters of potential of sustainable biomethane, and at the same time covering the soil, making carbon. Now 180 we will not make, but probably around about 40 is doable.
Okay, and just if I could, and that's very, we look forward to reading further, Harmen, those reports. Question in from Pádraig while I have you. What does Harmen attribute the growth in biomethane capacity in Europe to? Is it government stimulus? Is it feedstock availability, etc.? So what is the driver for that growth in biomethane capacity at a European level, in your opinion?
Very good question, but a very complex answer to that, because you see that especially in starting economies, there is a lot of subsidy given, and then after a while they start realizing that subsidy is not the real mechanism. So we see various systems in place which makes the system grow. For example, in Italy, they are going to convert the existing biogas to CHP and heat installations towards biomethane. They'll put a pot of money to that to make this conversion happening. But the production of biomethane is market driven in that way. So it's only a capex subsidy. If you look to the bioenergy production, that is fully without subsidy. If you look to the heat side, sometimes the government are putting incentives there. Not always ideal. I rather would make sure that, especially in these times where the gas price is so high, that maybe they lift the barrier on the taxes for green gas. And that would already enormously help.
Okay, thanks, Harmen. If I could bring you, Paul, in and just to address a question from Andy there, and I think it was Paddy that made the reference in terms of the cost of abatement. We're bringing Paddy on this as well. If the cost of abatement is 450 to 650 euros per tonne, why is the government not looking at pushing carbon markets to incentivize like farming to reduce emissions? There is a vibrant voluntary carbon market in the US, but no real plans for EU or other than compliance markets, which doesn't cover areas like agriculture. There needs to be incentives in place, as no point putting penalties in place, as a lot of farmers won't be able to afford the fines and therefore won't work. So could you give your comments on that particular point, Paul, around carbon farming, carbon markets, and also maybe pick up on some of the points that Harmen made in terms of the opportunities from a biomethane perspective that could exist here if it was to be embraced.
Thanks very much.
If I may, Paul, just as a quick note on that, because this is quite topical, I just want to note that that's from the basis of discussion, those numbers, and I believe those numbers are to be confirmed to the Climate Council in the coming weeks or months in terms of the cost of abatement. So I just want to put a little bit of a caveat around those. But secondly, you know, agriculture is the area that constantly asks me the question, where do our carbon credits go? So I think the link between subsidies and payments and carbon through forestry or through, you know, BPS payments on hedgerows and so on and so forth, this is a very topical area, and really an area where there is a lot of revenue potentially that potentially people are missing out on.
Okay, Paul. Thanks, Paddy.
Thanks, Paddy. Yeah, and I suppose look within these kind of studies, cost of abatements are always high because they only focus on economic indicators only. And as we see with bioenergy, it's not just about emissions; it's about jobs, it's about biodiversity, it's about land use. So we're just monetizing one specific element of it in terms of emissions. So they're always relatively high, and this is right across the board. For EVs, heat pumps, bioenergy. So the cost always look inflate. The economic cost always looks inflated when compared to the environmental benefit, because unfortunately we don't monetize a lot of the environmental benefits within those types of analysis. But it does give you kind of a helpful merit order in understanding where to start and where to finish. But coming back to it was Andy's point, actually, like that's a really good question. Now, let me give you the short version. It's tricky. And actually there was a piece in the Farmers Journal about 2 weeks ago with the minister coming out and thinking, he was saying, there was a question about who owns the credits. And it's actually, look, the state actually own the credits. The government own everything under our feet at the moment. So within the current legislation in Ireland, agriculture is actually within what we call the non-traded sectors, within the non-ETS sectors. And there is some level of transferability between emissions from land use into those sectors. And those sectors are about reducing our emissions outside of electricity. And actually, funnily enough, Sean, from a legal European perspective, that's actually where our emissions reduction obligations lie. Ireland doesn't have a national emissions reduction policy for electricity. We have a European obligation and across the ETS, and the burden of reduction there actually rests with companies, not with communities, not with the state. So within the state, we need to reduce our emissions from agriculture, heat, and transport. And there is some fungibility between what we call the LULUCF credits there at the moment. But now that doesn't preclude community groups and farmers setting up their own type of internal carbon trading scheme. And I know there are some groups looking very seriously at that, because again, it's a positive thing, because it creates good signals to farmers who might have a bit of extra land, but who want to get out of farming, and they might have a neighbor who's big into dairy, and they might be looking for a bit of extra land. It allows those when the cooperative movements to maybe work together and to maybe trade permits within a certain limited amount, but it doesn't contribute to the national scheme. And I think carbon trading and carbon farming is going to become more and more important in Ireland. Climate change, yes, will be a driver, but also looking at nitrates, looking at what's coming down the road for nitrates for farming in Ireland is going to be incredibly difficult, to maintain the same level of intensity. So I think localized carbon credits and carbon trading is a good idea. Now, coming back quickly, Sean, to the science, we need to do a lot more work really on the science. Conceptually, the idea of burying carbon in the soils is really good, but we need to measure it, we need to monitor it, we need to verify it, and we need to certify it before it becomes credible. And there's a gap in the science there. It'll probably be another couple of years. So I think we're a little way out there yet.
Okay, just as a follow-on point there from Andy, he's asking, why isn't there a push for voluntary markets where dairy cooperatives are able to buy credits where these offset their own emissions and this flows back to farmers? And he's saying that this is happening in the voluntary US voluntary market. And I think the point you're making, Paul, is that it's quite a complicated area, first of all, in terms of many.
It is starting though, Sean. It is starting. There are a number of cooperatives who are very proactive, and they're looking at this internal trading of carbon credits within different cooperatives. That's a healthy thing. It's a good thing because it encourages efficiencies. It encourages to do the right type of farming on the right type of land. The challenge, though, Sean, is confirmed by the minister 2 weeks ago. Within a national perspective, the credits belong to the state, and we have to be careful not to double count those permits.
Yeah. Okay. Christian, if I could bring you in just on a general point, I was on a recent discussion or webinar which you presented at, and you showed a huge growth in the pellet market at a European level and the deployment of pellet stoves. Can you just give us an outline of that growth which has happened in the last year, 2 years, and also where that has happened, because it's a very good story in displacing, and what are the drivers for that growth as well?
Yes, I'm happy to talk about that. That affects directly my work in the Austrian Pellet Industry Association. And we are very excited these times because we see a phenomenal development of the market. Pellet boiler sales have doubled twice in the German market, and they're now selling up to 80,000 pellet boilers a year in Germany. We see very rapid expansion also in France and in Austria, similar a very rapid increase of pellet boiler sales. Now, what is driving this? I think it's two things. Firstly, in these countries, people are fairly aware of the climate crisis and the need to change their habits. So there is a kind of positive attitude to change to carbon neutral fuels. Secondly, there are incentives in place that make it much easier to invest into a pellet boiler system. In Germany, very high incentives up to 45% of the investment costs are kind of paid for by the state. In Austria, it's about 30%. That is enough. It works very well, and people are quite eager now to change. Finally, in Austria, we are waiting for a law to be passed that will make the change away from oil obligatory. So you will gradually see that oil heating systems must be phased out that have a certain age. And that is also kind of definitely improving the willingness of people to think about an alternative. So these factors play a role. One thing I would like to mention is the abatement cost of heating with pellets is zero. So the levelized cost of heating with pellets is the same as with oil and gas or lower. The fuel costs are significantly lower at this point in time. Obviously, there is an investment to be made, but that is also a point I think that needs to be pointed out. The levelized costs are practically at the same level. There are no abatement costs. There is just the need to get this going and to kick this off. And with the ETS kind of being extended into the heat markets and the traffic markets will lead to steadily rising costs of fossil fuels, and that we have a market-driven development.
Okay, I'll just bring you in a second, Paddy. Just one follow-on point in terms of the supply of pellets to satisfy the need of the increase in drive or increased rollout of technology. Could you just elaborate on that? Is there a ready-made supply? And maybe just explain, because we have people that mightn't fully understand the production process in terms of wood pellets, but maybe you could just outline that as well briefly, Christian, for us.
Sure. Wood pellets are being produced from the residues of wood processing and from the residues of logging in the forests. Most in Europe, it's mostly wood processing. US producers are also using unusable trees that are harvested during the process of harvesting. So that is the raw material. It is dried and then densified to produce these little pieces. And pellets is a rapidly growing commodity throughout the world. It's going to be produced everywhere in Europe, in Asia, in America, and it will be available. There is already today a world market of pellets, and that is an opportunity that can be also used in Ireland, in my opinion.
Yeah. So it's from pellets are generated from sustainable forest management. So they're a key component of the sustainable management of our forests, and we will discuss that next week as part of our second webinar with the Minister and our other guests. But just it's very important that that's pointed out. And obviously, as the production of structural timber and the growth of structural timber in terms of our buildings and everything grows, the amount of sawdust which is generated from that processing of that timber increases. So that all helps and assists in terms of driving the resource, the pellet resource, which could be utilized in these appliances. One final point, and sorry to before bringing Paddy, air quality is a big issue that's been thrown again at us in Ireland. We saw a recent publication of the proposed solid fuel regulations, where there's a moisture level is going to be implemented on wood fuels, which we have welcomed as an association because we're certifying wood fuel suppliers through our WFQA process, which is worked on by our colleague Noel Gavigan. So is air quality posing a problem across any of the member states where you're working, Christian? in terms of this whole biomass area? And maybe just briefly, if you could comment on that, and then I'll bring in Paddy.
What I can tell you is that we have had a phenomenal improvement of technology over the last decades. And the last step, which was taken in the last 2 or 3 years, actually is that our pellet boilers are on the market. You can call them zero emission. So they are the level of emissions, it cannot be detected by normal laboratory equipment. So that is what we have achieved. So I believe there is absolutely no issue with air quality at all with modern technology. Absolutely no issue.
Thanks for that clarification, Christian. If I could now bring in Paddy, and then what I will do is just go for a final comment maybe from all of our speakers this morning. And I think there's one question, Paul, in the chat, again, on the carbon trading area, which you might focus on in your concluding remarks. So Paddy, I'll bring in you, and then I'll give you an opportunity to come back at the end to close the event. So Paddy, if you could just, I think you wanted to comment on maybe some of the input from Christian.
Yeah, I think it probably slots nicely into the wrap up, if that makes sense, Sean. I think, you know, as president of the Irish Bioenergy Association, there is a current scheme in Ireland called the SSRH, which supports the conversion of from fossil fuel heated systems across to renewable ones sourced from bioenergy, biogas, or heat pumps. The scheme is almost 2.5 years open now and has been quite slow and delayed in terms of getting projects successfully through it. I think we can all acknowledge that the handful that have come through is quite disappointing in a period of 2 years or more of a scheme. However, noting now that IrBEA has put significant time and effort into, you know, aligning all of the processes and, you know, working with the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland to simplify the process. One of the biggest challenges that we're finding in terms of people who want to make the change is being able to access the support and the bureaucracy associated and the paperwork around grants and so on and so forth. What I will say, just to summarize that, or to final point, is now that the building blocks are there in terms of sustainable support scheme for renewable heat, I would urge the industry to really consider taking this scheme forward now and availing of the program that is there. It is and does require, in all climate action projects, whether it's transport, wind, solar, bioenergy, you require proper planning, proper environmental assessment, and proper, you know, design and commissioning, like any good project, to avoid some of the historical issues that might have been around reputation that Paul touched on. Ultimately, it's up to the industry to take forward the schemes that exist, and on building a successful streamline of projects rurally and urbanly across this initial program that does exist, will be a very strong foothold to build a case for larger scale supports around industrial heat demand, tertiary and others. And similarly in the transport space, moving the dial in terms of policy and influence. So there is a significant chunk of work ahead for the industry to take up this opportunity, which I think quite eloquently has been identified and likely to be market driven in the future. So the opportunity is great, and it's really up to us as citizens right across Ireland, you know, to buy into the decarbonisation of this economy.
Yeah, and thanks very much for that point. And we have some SEI reps on our webinar this morning, and we have worked very closely with the SEI, and we do have regular meetings to help and assist and play our part in trying to get this scheme rolled out. We did take on the challenge around air emissions and air quality in the form of the Keystone report, and we're also working with our suppliers to drive the biomass market in terms of giving certainty about the supply of biomass, and are now embarked upon the development of a biomass capacity statement within from the organisation as well, developed for our members to give that certainty. So we will continue to work with the SEI to ensure that the scheme rolls out and that the objectives of it are achieved. If I could go to Paul just for your concluding remarks, and maybe we are obviously focused this morning on goal 1, securing global net zero by mid-century and keeping 1.5 degrees within reach. I think you're very strongly saying, Paul, that can be achieved, but we need bioenergy to achieve that. So if you maybe could give your concluding remarks, and I know there was a question in there in the chat again, maybe a further question on the carbon, so markets and trading. So maybe just to call on you to give your concluding remarks, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Thanks, everyone. Again, just looking at the science, we need everything. The challenge is just massive. It's remarkable. I think it's underestimated really right across the globe, socially, politically. It's enormous. We need everything. We need renewables. We need energy efficiency, and bioenergy is fundamentally important. That just reflects the science, it reflects the policy, and reflects the evidence and the facts within the information. So that's very clear. We need it globally, and we need it here in Ireland. Bioenergy won't be able to do everything. Renewables, in terms of wind and solar, can't do everything, but together they'll get us most of the way, along with energy efficiency, and that's really important. But it's not going to be easy. It's going to be very challenging, but it's worth a shout, because bioenergy is wonderful, because it's not just about reducing emissions. It's about giving opportunities to farming communities. It's about industry. It's about the land use impacts, biodiversity. So I think the real key in success here, Sean, is trying to pick across those opportunities and those benefits, and to try and amplify them, because if we only look at the problems and talk about the problems, we won't get to the solutions at all. And just lastly, just maybe in relation to the question there into the carbon credits, yes, look, I completely agree. The soil sampling program, I think, launched by the Minister of Agriculture, was only launched a couple of weeks ago. So measuring, verification and reporting of soil carbon is a prerequisite really before doing anything sensible with carbon markets in Ireland, but it's the way to go forward.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul, and thanks for your very insightful comments and input this morning. Harmen, go to you for your concluding remarks for this morning. So how can biomethane play its role in securing global net zero? And just maybe one question that came in there was about the reports which you referred to. And could you point us in the direction of those studies, and maybe they're available on your website, or
Yeah, on that last point, Sean, I will send it to you. I had to dig in myself to find it right, so no that problem. It will be shared later.
So sorry, Harmen, on that. If I could ask the anonymous attendee, if they want to just send us, as we don't know who it is, if they want us to send a quick email to us, we can get that report to them or to you once you forward it to us, Harmen. So sorry for interrupting.
All right, okay, no problem. So yeah, concluding remarks is that I think it's time that biogas and biomethane is to be recognized and to be embraced, not only because of its energy, but also because it has a multiple positive knock-on effects on employment, on rural development, on agriculture, on soil restoration, and thus also providing the renewable energy we need actually for our future. And there is no time to wait. Ready?
Thanks very much, Harmen, for those remarks and for your contribution this morning, taking time out to join us. Christian, if I could come to you, maybe for your concluding remarks, and also the role of, and I know you're more focused on the solid biomass area, but the role of solid biomass pellets in securing global net zero by mid-century and keeping within that 1.5 degree within reach.
One thing I would like to highlight is that already today, all pellets that are being used in the industrial field are sustainability certified in a very elaborate process. So third-party inspection of each and every process of the sourcing of the biomass, etc., etc. So sustainability is an issue we are paying a lot of attention to. One thing I should add is we see very exciting projects where we have bioenergy use combined with carbon capture, which actually reduces CO2 levels in the atmosphere. It's, for the time being, the only option we have to do that. And I think that is another aspect that is really very important and pointing to the future of our sector.
Thanks very much, Christian. Again, thanks for your contribution this morning. Paddy, just if you could very briefly maybe give any concluding remarks that you have, and we'll close up then.
Thank you, Sean. And again, thank you to all the speakers, and particular thanks to Sean and Teresa for organising what I personally have found a very informative conference. Again, a conference which I sense gives us the vision, it gives us the sight of the opportunity. We've looked out to 2050, we've looked out to 2030. We can see that bioenergy has a role to play. It's very reassuring that markets are potentially going to play a larger part than policy, because markets will always attract investment. Markets will always attract people to move to do the right thing when it comes to the market. And the note that Paul made, that the climate case from a science perspective is there. The financial case is the piece that we now must fill in to support us as a nation moving in the direction of renewables and achieving right across all the technologies the 51% reduction in emissions. There's a lot of individual parts that form in that. There is a lot of work that we as an association in IrBEA are doing and continue to do. And to summarize it in one sentence, it is up to each of us individually, citizens, but also very importantly as an industry, to make this case and to prove the point and move this forward at the pace we need to do so.
Thanks very much, Paddy. I think they're very apt comments to conclude on. I'd like to thank our speakers. Thanks to Paul, Deane, thanks to Harmen, Dekker, thanks to Christian Rakos, thanks to Paddy Phelan for your contributions. And just to finally conclude, I'd like to thank all our attendees this morning. We had a very good attendance, excellent attendance, and I would encourage you to log on to our next session and to register for it for next week and indeed the next two after that. Finally, just to thank Teresa O'Brien for all our hard work and efforts in terms of making this a success, and we look forward to speaking with you again at the same time next week. So we conclude on that. I hope you have a good day and continue to stay safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.